I thought it would be just another quiet weekend in the woods with my dad. But that night, when I heard the tent zipper slide open, I knew something was terribly wrong. And by the time the sun rose, nothing would ever be the same. The forest was draped in fog, thick and unmoving, turning the towering pines into silhouettes and the road into a soft blur. Evan Blake sat quietly in the back seat of his father's SUV, watching the world pass by in silence. The trip had been planned for weeks, just a short weekend retreat, a chance to disconnect. Walter Blake, his father, had called it an overdue break from the noise. Alongside Walter were a few of his old friends from his years in law enforcement, Dean Voss and Nate Lawson, both loud and full of stories. Evan had met them before, but being around them still made him feel like a guest in someone else's world. Their laughter filled the car, while Evan kept mostly to himself, eyes fixed on the mist-wrapped trees. Something about the trip felt different. It wasn't the location or the people. It was a feeling, subtle but constant, like a shadow at the edge of his awareness. Walter had seemed more reserved than usual on the drive, his voice calm but tight, as if holding back something he didn't want to name. They arrived just before nightfall, the sky washed in deep violet and rust. The clearing was quiet, nestled by a narrow creek, the tree line forming a tall wall of quiet. Walter and the others unpacked with the ease of routine. Evan helped set up tents and gather wood for the fire, his hands moving automatically, his mind somewhere else. The fire burned steadily as night took over. They sat around it, their faces lit in orange and gold, passing stories like well-worn coins. Dean talked about a flood call in winter. Nate recounted an arrest gone sideways. Evan listened, but didn't contribute, content to let their voices fill the silence. Occasionally, he noticed Leo Bennett, his father's closest friend, watching him from across the fire. It wasn't obvious or unsettling, just a quiet curiosity in Leo's expression. He'd known Leo since childhood. There had always been a respectful distance between them, but now Evan sensed something more, something unreadable. As the evening grew colder, fog rolled in from the woods, clinging low to the ground. The fire cracked, and laughter faded into softer tones. Walter eventually stood, stretching and calling a night. One by one, they disappeared into their tents. Evan lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of his tent. The sounds of the forest settled around him, whined through the branches, distant calls of night birds, the subtle groan of trees shifting. He tried to sleep, but his thoughts raced with images and questions he couldn't form into words. Somewhere between sleep and waking, he felt a flicker of panic, his mind conjuring a sound near the zipper of the tent. His breath caught, but when he opened his eyes, nothing had changed. There was no movement, no sado, just the whisper of wind and the echo of a dream that had already begun to dissolve. He turned onto his side and pulled the sleeping bag tighter. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe it was exhaustion. The day had been long. The unfamiliar setting, the heavy fog, the laughter of strangers, it was enough to stir even a quiet mind. Still, as he drifted into sleep, a thought remained at the edge of his mind. Something about this place, this trip, this weekend, it was different. He didn't know why. Not yet, but he would. The morning came slowly, creeping through the veil of mist that still clung to the trees. Evan Blake hadn't slept more than a few scattered minutes. His body still wrapped in the same position, head assumed the moment Leo had left his tent. The heaviness in his limbs wasn't just fatigue. It was the weight of uncertainty, of confusion wrapped tightly around him like the morning cold. He unzipped the tent carefully and stepped into the pale light. Around him, the campsite had returned to normal. Birds called from the treetops, and voices echoed from the fire pit where Walter was already cooking breakfast. The scent of smoke and sizzling bacon filled the air, grounding the moment in an eerie sense of routine. Nate Lawson and Dean Voss were chuckling about something Evan couldn't quite hear, their backs turned as they stirred mugs of instant coffee. It was as though nothing had happened, but something had, something Evan couldn't forget. He glanced across the clearing and saw Leo Bennett, standing near the edge of the trees with a tin cup in his hand. Their eyes met for just a heartbeat. Leo gave a casual nod, Nothing unusual. No signal. No indication of what had transpired hours before. But Evan felt the chill return to his spine, the way one might react to stepping over the memory of a nightmare that hadn't quite ended. He thought about telling his father, but what would he even say? That Leo had entered his tent in the middle of the night and just watched him? It sounded ridiculous, even to himself. And there was a deeper reason, too, something beneath logic or fear. It was the dread that maybe Walter wouldn't believe him, or worse, that he would. Instead, Evan forced a smile and joined the others, accepting a plate of eggs and trying not to flinch when Leo walked past behind him. Later that morning, Walter gathered the group for a hike. He said it would be an easy loop through the hills nearby, something scenic. Everyone seemed eager, laughing, relaxed, unaware. Evan strapped on his backpack and fell to the back of the group, his gaze scanning the trail ahead, but also the woods around them. Each shadow felt too deep, each rustle too close. Leo walked near the middle, but it didn't take long before he drifted back, just enough to be close again. Evan noticed him before he spoke. That quiet weight of presence was unmistakable now. "You didn't sleep well," Leo said quietly, his voice pitched low so no one else would hear. The words were framed like an observation, not a question. Evan kept his eyes on the trail, unwilling to give anything away. He muttered a non-committal response, hoping silence would create distance. But Leo didn't fall behind. He kept pace, step for step, just at the edge of Evan's vision. The trail narrowed, winding between mossy boulders and tangled roots, and Evan picked up speed, trying to move ahead. The others' voices faded as they rounded a bend, giving Leo another opening. "The forest can do strange things to your head," he said, his voice smooth. "The shadows, the sounds, makes it hard to know what's real." Evan's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his heart pounded in his chest like a signal he couldn't silence. There was a shift in Leo's expression, something unreadable but deliberate. His words weren't just about the woods. He was talking about the previous night, about the silence Evan had chosen. And Evan realized Leo wasn't just testing boundaries. He was measuring them. The hike continued through thick groves and up narrow paths, each step a tug between the present and the night before. Evan tried to focus on the trail, on the scratch of branches against his jacket or the smell of pine in the air. Anything but the closeness of Leo's footsteps. They reached a high ridge after what felt like hours. The others gathered near the edge, admiring the view. Evan stepped away, letting the wind cool his skin, trying to breathe. But Leo approached again, quietly, calmly, like nothing had changed. "You didn't say anything," he said, voice low. "Not one word to your dad." The implication sat heavy between them. Evan shrugged, staring out over the tree line. "I didn't think there was anything to say." Leo gave a soft, knowing chuckle. "That's good," he said. "It's important to know who you can trust, who knows how to keep a moment private." He reached out, brushing Evan's shoulder lightly, just enough to send a message, to remind him. It could have been mistaken for a friendly gesture, a reassuring touch. But Evan knew better now. He stepped away, not responding, leaving Leo in silence behind him. They returned to camp by early evening. Evan felt hollow, as though every step had drained something essential from him. The others were cheerful, trading trail stories and planning the next meal. But all Evan could think about was the unspoken tension, how easily it could hide in plain sight. He sat by the fire as dusk settled, letting the heat of the flames warm his hands while his thoughts remained cold. Leo joined the others, his laughter smooth, his face unreadable. But Evan knew that this wasn't over. Whatever had begun between them in silence was only getting stronger. Evening settled over the woods with an eerie stillness, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Evan Blake sat near the campfire again, but he felt like a stranger among familiar faces. Laughter floated through the clearing, the others chatting and teasing each other over burnt marshmallows and old memories. Yet every sound passed through Evan like smoke, seen, heard, but not felt. His gaze stayed low, fixed on the shifting coals. Across from him, Leo Bennett seemed relaxed, effortlessly blending in with the group. He spoke little but smiled at the right moments, added a comment here and there, always present, always composed. No one else noticed anything different, but Evan did. Every glance, every shift in Leo's posture carried a quiet message only he seemed to hear. At one point, Leo began telling a story about an old case, some internal affairs mess that almost cost one of them their badge. His tone was casual, colored by years of distance and detachment. But there was something pointed in the way he described loyalty. He spoke of silent understandings, of knowing when to look away, when to cover for someone without question. "That's real trust," he said at the end, letting the words settle in the firelight. Evan didn't look at him, but he could feel the heat of Leo's gaze across the flames. That line wasn't meant for the group. It was for him. He couldn't take it anymore. Murmuring something vague about needing a walk, Evan rose and stepped away from the fire. His legs felt heavy, but the further he moved into the darkness, the easier it was to breathe. The narrow path behind the tents led into the forest, winding through the tall pines like a thread unraveling from a frayed seam. The air was cooler here, cleaner, and the silence felt less artificial, less forced. He didn't hear Leo approach until he was already there. The sound of leaves crunching under boots made Evan turn. Leo stood just a few feet away, his silhouette defined by the dim glow that barely reached this far from camp. His expression was unreadable. No smile, no frown, just steady calm. Evan didn't speak. He couldn't. His mind spun with 1,000 questions he didn't know how to ask. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? Why can't I just walk away? But none of them made it to his lips. "You're not like the others," Leo said quietly, the words carried by the hush between trees. "Most people run from what they don't understand." Evan took a step back. His pulse quickened. The forest around them felt suddenly too quiet, too intimate. Leo moved closer, but not aggressively. There was no threat in his stance, just a presence that filled every inch of space. Evan should have turned back, should have said something sharp, clear, final. But he didn't. His body stayed still, caught between logic and something else entirely. Leo's hand brushed his arm. Light. Testing. The touch lasted less than a second, but it ignited something electric beneath Evan's skin. A shock of awareness, of confusion, of connection. He wanted to pull away, and yet he didn't. Leo leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. Secrets are powerful things. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It felt more like an invitation. Then the distance between them vanished. There was no sudden movement, no force. Just a slow, deliberate closing of space, a pause, and then the faintest contact. Leo's lips brushed Evan's, soft, tentative, testing for resistance. But Evan didn't resist. He didn't move at all. The kiss deepened gradually, like a tide rising without sound. Evan's breath caught, and something inside him fractured, something that had been holding back, resisting, protecting. His fingers clenched at his sides, unsure of what to do, what was right, what was real. But Leo's hand moved gently, sliding up his neck, grounding him. There was no urgency, no spoken word, just the quiet pressure of connection, of two people trapped in a moment neither could explain. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Evan stood still, staring at the ground between them, his mind spinning in all directions. He didn't know who he was in this moment, or what it meant. Leo didn't press. He simply gave him a long look, something between acknowledgement and understanding, and turned away, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he'd come. Evan remained rooted to the spot, long after the sound of Leo's footsteps faded. The trees around him whispered with wind, but his thoughts screamed louder. He had no answers, only the sensation of warmth on his lips and the echo of something dangerous growing stronger inside him. When he finally returned to camp, the others were still talking, oblivious. Leo sat near the fire, laughing at something Dean had said, as if nothing had happened, as if the forest hadn't just shifted beneath their feet. Evan sat down slowly, joining the circle, his face composed, but his mind in chaos. He couldn't stop replaying what had happened, couldn't define it, couldn't explain the storm that now churned quietly within. All he knew was that something had broken loose, and it wasn't going back in a box. The morning sun filtered through the pines, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. Evan Blake lay motionless inside his tent, eyes open, staring at the ceiling of thin fabric above him. The memory of the previous night lingered, not as a fleeting thought, but as something etched into his skin. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the moment everything shifted. He didn't know how long he stayed like that, listening to the quiet sounds outside, zippers, footsteps, muffled laughter. It all seemed distant, like it belonged to a world he wasn't part of anymore. When he finally unzipped the tent and stepped into the sunlight, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth greeted him. The camp looked the same. Dean Voss was heating coffee over the fire. Nate Lawson was rummaging through a supply bag, cracking a joke Evan couldn't quite catch. His father, Walter Blake, stood nearby, talking animatedly with a stick of jerky in one hand. Everything felt familiar, but Evan had changed. His eyes found Leo Bennett, who leaned against a tree on the edge of the clearing, holding a tin cup and watching the scene unfold with calm detachment. Their eyes met briefly. There was no smile, no acknowledgement, just a flicker of recognition. An unspoken truth hung between them, quiet and immovable. They didn't speak during breakfast. Evan picked at his food, trying to appear engaged, but every movement, every casual comment felt rehearsed, as if he were going through motions from a script he no longer believed in. He caught himself glancing at Leo more than once, not out of fear but searching. For what? He didn't yet know. The day unfolded slowly. Walter suggested a walk down to a nearby river he remembered from past trips. It was tradition, he said, something they used to do every time they camped in this part of the woods. No one objected. They packed light, just canteens and a few snacks, and followed a narrow trail through the forest. The ground was soft with pine needles. The light, filtered through branches, felt delicate, almost sacred. As the group spread out, Evan found himself lagging behind, letting the others move ahead. The sounds of their laughter and footsteps grew faint. Eventually, he spotted Leo slowing his pace, then veering off the main path. Evan hesitated for only a moment before following. They reached the river in silence. It was shallow and wide, its surface glittering in the sunlight. Rocks jutted out of the water, smooth and worn by years of flow. Evan found a flat one near the bank and sat. Leo joined him, but kept some distance between them. There was no tension in his movements, just quiet awareness. They sat like that for a while, listening to the water. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. Neither of them rushed to speak. There was no point in pretending small talk could fill the space they now shared. Finally, Leo broke the quiet. "I didn't mean for things to get confusing," he said, voice calm, almost careful. Evan turned slightly toward him. The words weren't an apology, but they weren't empty either. There was something in Leo's tone that suggested he, too, was figuring it out as he went. "Everything feels different now," Evan replied. His voice was soft, as if saying it too loud would make it more real. Leo nodded slowly, his eyes on the water. Sometimes that's how it starts. You think you're standing still, and then suddenly you're somewhere else entirely. The vulnerability in those words caught Evan off guard. It stripped away the confidence Leo usually carried, revealing something more uncertain underneath. A person not in control, but affected. Neither of them moved. Leo reached out, not to touch Evan, but to place his hand lightly on the rock between them, close enough to notice, but not enough to demand. It was a gesture without pressure, a silent offering of presence. Evan looked at that hand for a moment, then back at the water. Part of him wanted to close the gap, to reach out, but another part told him it wasn't time, that this moment wasn't about decisions or declarations. It was about understanding. Before he could respond, voices echoed through the trees. The others were calling, laughing, making their way back from upstream. Leo withdrew his hand without comment. He stood and glanced down at Evan with a faint nod, a gesture of reassurance, or perhaps just acknowledgement of something left unsaid. They returned to the group like nothing had happened. Back at camp, the mood was light again. Jokes were traded, gear was sorted, and tents slowly came down one by one. Evan moved through it all on autopilot. His body worked without thinking, rolling sleeping bags, folding tarps, but his mind was elsewhere. He caught glimpses of Leo from time to time. Nothing obvious, just glances. But they meant something now. Everything did. As they loaded up the car, Evan turned one last time toward the clearing. The place looked unchanged. But in every tree, every step of the path, every flicker of firelight from the night before, something remained. Something unspoken and unfinished. They drove in silence most of the way back. Evan rested his head against the window, watching the forest blur past. The quiet between him and Leo was no longer cold. It had become something else, something waiting. The car rolled to a quiet stop in front of Evan Blake's house, just as the sky began to shift from blue to golden haze. The ride home had passed in near silence, but not the kind that felt awkward, rather the kind that followed something unspoken, something understood. Evan stepped out first, stretching his back and feeling the subtle weight of the weekend settle in his shoulders. His father, Walter, gave him a solid pat on the back and a tired smile. The kind of farewell you give after sharing something that didn't need words. Evan glanced toward the passenger seat. Leo Bennett was still there, resting his arm on the window. Their eyes met for only a second. No nas, no gestures. Just the briefest recognition, one that held an entire shared story between it. He turned and walked up the path to his front door. The house looked just as it had 2 days ago, untouched by everything that had shifted inside him since. He stepped inside, let his backpack slide to the floor, and paused in the silence. The smell of home, fabric softener, old wood, a hint of something familiar in the kitchen, washed over him. He moved slowly through the house, ending up in his room where the light fell across the floor in strips. It was quiet here, but in his chest, something still hummed. Not confusion, not anxiety, just change. He sat on the edge of his bed and thought back. On the sounds of the river, the quiet glances across camp, the moments that had passed between words. There had been no grand moment, no confessions, just a feeling that grew quietly like roots beneath the soil. That night in the forest hadn't ended with certainty. It had opened a door he hadn't known was there. And now, back in his world of routines and clean sheets, that door remained. Later, as the street outside his window grew dim, Evan found himself walking again. No destination, just movement. The trees here were thinner, the air different, but his thoughts wandered back to the woods, to the quiet between fireside laughter and long trails. Back to the presence he had felt beside him. He sat on a bench beneath a maple and stared at the fading sky. The feeling was still there, not loud, not sharp, just persistent. A quiet truth that something had begun, even if he didn't yet understand what it would become. He didn't know if Leo would reach out again, or if he wanted him to, but he knew the connection they shared wasn't imagined. It had been real in the stillness, in the looks, in the way they had left things open. Back home, Evan crawled into bed with the window cracked open. The air moved gently across the room. He closed his eyes, not trying to make sense of everything, but allowing himself to feel it. He didn't have the answers, didn't need them tonight. The silence that once felt like uncertainty now felt like possibility. And as sleep finally came, Evan understood what happened in those woods wasn't over. It had only just begun.